Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this weekend edition of Hebrew Word Study. It's been a few weeks since I've shared, had the holiday, and then we were out of town, and so glad to be back doing this again. The lesson today is one that I don't know, I just was not able to get out of my mind. Um, Being a couple weeks ago that we were in the Easter season, resurrection season time frame. Of course, what I like to do is read the four accounts in the Gospels of the crucifixion and the resurrection. It's how I relate, and it's just the tradition that I do every year. But this year, as I was reading it a few weeks ago, something just stuck with me that I have not been able to get out of my mind, and I needed to do some study on it, and I thought I would share it with you. And what has happened is this has grown into more than just one lesson in the 10 to 15 minutes that I like to keep these lessons recorded to. And so the topic here, and I don't even know that I've finished what my study is on it yet. I'm going to be continuing it after this, but I want to give you what I've gotten so far and then just see where it goes from here. And this has to do with the account of the sign that was written on the cross that Jesus hung on. Some kind of sign that was hung on the cross. And as I was reading through the four Gospels, I realized that there was a difference. All four of them had a different account or um, I don't know what the right word is, but they each told the wording of the sign differently. And this really stuck with me, and I just was not able to get this out of my mind to process this. There are many things in the Gospels that are different between the four Gospels, and I can understand that as a different viewpoint, maybe somewhat of a different time frame. We know Matthew had a Jewish background, probably wrote the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew, and so he would have had a different understanding. Mark is more of a viewpoint through the Apostle Peter and has more of an Aramaic background to it because that's where Peter went to. Luke is more of a Gentile background, and he was not even really an eyewitness to everything, although we'll talk about that too, that he was a Gentile who joined Paul's group in the book of Acts. And then there's John, who was the disciple who Jesus loved, and the book of John was written last. Mark thought to be Mark being first, maybe Mark and Matthew kind of vie for that first written, Luke being after that, and then finally John being written presumably around 96 years afterwards, after the birth of Jesus. So again, very different accounts, but there's only one sign, there's only one cross. The wording on it was not up for debate. It was what was written, and why didn't they get it all the same is really what was going through my mind. And so I thought with this new understanding or learning that we have on looking at the ancient documents, and this would be moving out of the English translation, because remember, English is just a translation, and it was not their native language. Aramaic was the native language of the time. And so, what would things have looked like from that viewpoint? And I was going through my mind is there anything we can learn by looking at some of the ancient manuscripts that we have of the Gospels, and see if there's something that can shed some light onto why there are four different accounts of what was written on the cross of Jesus. So that's where we're started. Not sure how far this is going to grow, even what I'm going to learn from it. I want to be very open with you and just share that this is not an attempt to debunk or anything. It's just an attempt to learn. This sign was put up there for a reason. What was the reason? What are we supposed to learn from this? And why is it, in four different accounts written four different ways, is that supposed to tell us something? Is there something we can glean from this? So that's my mindset. So as you see on your screen right now, the four accounts are Matthew chapter 27, verse 37, where it says, and again, these are English. The plan here is to give you a basis for what it was in English as we understand it, and then next week go into the biblical languages and see, was it translated properly? Or are there different ways of translating it? Are there different interpretations or different translations, different accounts in the different languages that maybe bring it closer together or see what it tells us? But anyway, Matthew 27, verse 37 says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Mark 15, verse 26 just says, "The King of the Jews." It doesn't list his name. Um, Luke says, "This is the King of the Jews." Again, not listing the name of Jesus, but it has the "this is." And then finally, John in chapter 19, verse 19 says, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." So we have some differences. The consistent part is the King of the Jews. That's consistent. Everybody got that the same. But then the other parts of it is Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, or "this is." um, what does this all mean, and what could be the reasons why there's some differences here? So that's where we're going to go into. Um, Again, we're going to start looking at some of the other languages. We know that in Matthew is where we start, um, where I want to start. And what we see here in Matthew chapter 27 is the Greek version. This is taken from Bible Hub. It's an interlinear format. And again, I know just enough Greek to muddle my way through it. But what you'll see here is that um, kind of circling it with my cursor, you see these letters that are all in capitals. This is the writing in Greek that was ascribed to in the book of Matthew to be on this sign. And what's interesting here is they're put in capital letters. Now, in Hebrew, there is no capitalization. There's no small letters, there's no large letters. And actually, in Greek, we're going to find that this was a later adaptation also, that there were no small letters. Everything was written in one size font. And in fact, they didn't have any spaces between the letters. And so what I want to scroll down here is show you um, a picture, again, the artist's rendition of what the sign on the cross could have looked like. I think that was very interesting. You can see I have a lot of information here. Um, so what we see here at the top of the screen is a kind of a black and white writing with the top letters being the Latin. And we're going to find out later that there were only Luke and John finally told us that there were three translations of this. Um, Matthew and Mark do not even mention that it was written in any language, let alone three translations. So when we look at this, we see the top line being Latin, using the letters that we're very familiar with, as we use in our English alphabet. You'll notice that there is no distance or no gaps in between. Latin does read like English does from left to right, and so you'll be able to make out some of the words. You see the word Nazarene being written here, and then, of course, then you see these other words that are in Latin, but say King of the Jews. The second line you'll see here is Greek. Greek also reads from left to right, just like English and Latin does. And so we'll see those letters. But again, notice there's no gaps in between because early writing did not have any spaces in between. And it's somewhat interesting because it was pointed out linguistically that when we talked, as I'm talking to you right now, I do not speak and allow gaps in between the words that I am speaking. Of course, you I did at that time, and it sounds really strange. But notice that when we speak, we do not stop, we do not pause, except for effect. So there are no gaps in between. The gaps in between came later as people became more literate. And again, that's something to be reminded of is that we live in a very more literate society today than there ever has been during the space of history, time of history. And so people did not have the need to write. They were not literate. And so they were used to reading this as one continuous sentence. In fact, in some of the ancient Hebrew literature, it will say that the entire five books of first books of the Bible are one long sentence. That originally, when it was dictated and when it was written down, there were no gaps in between, no pauses, no breaks, no punctuation, no paragraphs, no one book division to the other book division. It was one long sentence from Genesis all the way through to the end of Deuteronomy. And so you can see that. And again, it seems very strange to us, but this is how the ancient world got along. And in fact, once you learn it and work with it a little bit, your mind does allow you to pick up on it and to figure it out. And it's really not a problem once you learn how to do it. It just takes a little practice. So the second line here is Greek. The bottom line here is Hebrew, which again is somewhat interesting. Is did they write it in Hebrew or did they write it in Aramaic, which was the language of the day? Hebrew, as we have been talking about, is written from right to left. So the Hebrew would start here on the right side. Right below it is another rendition. This one is written on wood, which we could assume that the sign that went on the cross was probably out of wood. How they put the letters on, whether it was engraved, probably not. Whether it was written with some sort of marker that they had was probably more likely. You notice the notches here. They claim they had found this somewhat in archaeological excavations of how this sign maybe would have had a rope around it and hung around or had some sort of hooks that allowed it to sit in because it was very common, as my understanding will share with you, for the um, uh, crosses to have signs that would list what the crime was. That's the word I was looking for. What the crime was for the malefactor hanging on the crosses, and it was meant to be a warning to everyone. What I've learned is that these crosses were not, 20 feet up in the air, 10 feet up in the air. They were very close to the ground because they wanted people to see it. And so the people hanging on the crosses, their feet were just barely above the ground, and that's all that was necessary. And then the sign was also very close to the ground too, so that people could this was meant to be an object lesson. It was meant to be a deterrent that anybody who messed with Rome suffered this penalty. And here were the charges of why these people were on these crosses and to not let yourself go down that pathway, basically to be a deterrent. So what you see here is this wooden board. The top row here has the Hebrew letters. These are slightly different type of script. There's an older type of Hebrew called Paleo Hebrew, and this seems to have borrowed some of this writing. There's also cursive forms of Hebrew, and this is somewhat a mix between them. The middle here looks to be the Latin, and then the Greek would be along the bottom. So I just want to give that to you to start to share as we go through this and as we start to look at, the meanings behind this and see what we can learn. So I hope this intrigues you. I hope you stay with us and that you'll come back next week as we take a deeper look and start looking at the different languages that this was written in and see if we can learn anything more about what the differences may be. So, all right, thanks a lot. God bless you, and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.